Hello, well, welcome everybody to this live stream from SANAD, stands for Standing Against Nefarious and Arbitrary Detentions, in which we're going to be looking at the theme of, does the West have double standards towards human rights in Saudi Arabia? We're going to go through to 2:30 p.m. We have two speakers, David Hay, a internationally recognized human rights lawyer, is our key speaker, but also Fahad Al-Gawadi, who is official spokesperson for SANAD and himself a human rights activist. My name is Dr. Sue Conlon. I'm on the advisory board of SANAD and have had pleasure working with them now over the last 2 years. And I'm going to just do a very brief introduction to the current sort of human rights situation, just a very quick overview of the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia, and begin to introduce some of these themes about under the question of does the West have double standards in relation to Saudi Arabia, and particularly the human rights violations that we are seeing going on. And then once David and Fahad have given us their contributions, we then hopefully will address some other questions that come up, and therefore a number of different things. But just by way of an introduction, and this was part of what was said to a SANAD annual report that was given in March in London. What we saw at the end of 2021, that some of the isolation that Saudi Arabia had experienced following the killing of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi, that began to change. Now, that murder of Jamal Khashoggi initially led to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman being isolated internationally, not least because of the reports that confirmed the prince's role in Khashoggi's assassination. But that began to change at the beginning of last year. Now, from a British perspective, one of the things that we saw in March of last year was a visit by the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson to Saudi Arabia. And on the day of his visit, Saudi Arabia carried out the largest mass execution in the country's history. 81 citizens were executed on charges relating to freedom of opinion and expression. Now, a statement was put out by the Prime Minister's office at the time of his visit, when Boris Johnson met Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And what that statement said from the Prime Minister's office, it said he was setting out the UK's view that we are facing a fundamentally changed world order following Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. There was, of course, no mention of Saudi Arabia's key role in Yemen. But the Prime Minister's office went on to say this requires countries to work together to improve energy security and reduce reliance on Russia. That statement continued, the Prime Minister and the Crown Prince agreed to collaborate and maintain stability in the energy market and continue the transition towards renewable and clean technology. The Prime Minister also gave a commitment to boost cooperation in defence, security, trade and culture. I just want to touch on one thing, not so much about what is happening within Saudi Arabia itself, but the role that Saudi Arabia plays in relation to the neighbouring country of Yemen. We know there are double standards when it comes to the West and which wars are taking place and who they provide arms to. But just by way of very brief statistics, almost 3 years ago now, in July 2020, the UK government announced that it would resume arms sales to Saudi Arabia. This followed a previous court decision in the United Kingdom that indicated that those sales should stop. So they stopped at one point because of Saudi violations of international law, not least because of the conflict in Yemen. But the UK government decided in July 2020 that intervention by Saudi Arabia and Yemen were isolated incidents. The published value of UK arms licensed for export to the Saudi-led coalition since the bombing of Yemen began in March 2015 is estimated at 9.4 billion, of which 7.9 billion has gone to Saudi Arabia alone. That's from the UK. And then if you include the BAE, the huge organization company, that company received 20 billion in revenue from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia Ministry of Defence and Aviation between 2015 and 2021. So that's part of the parcel of making sure that UK businesses can do business in Saudi Arabia without interruption. That doesn't mean, for example, that in the United Kingdom there is no attention to human rights violations. On the 28th of June last year, excuse me, there was a debate in the House of Commons, the lower part of the Houses of Parliament, on the death penalty and the spike in executions in Saudi Arabia. The question was asked of the Foreign Office. This was to ask the Secretary of State for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs if he will make a statement on Saudi Arabia's use of the death penalty and the recent spike in the number of executions taking place. There was therefore a brief debate. It's online, it's in the public domain. The person who answered for the British government was a person by the name of David Rutler, I think it was. He's the Under-Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs. He's not the Foreign Secretary. He was not the Foreign Secretary. Interestingly enough, if you look at his profile, he actually has no responsibility or no special interest in the Middle East or North Africa. His areas of responsibilities within the Foreign Office extend only to the Americas and the Caribbean. So why he was chosen to answer this point about the increase in executions, we can only lean to our own conclusions. But what he said was the following, and this is a public statement that is often repeated. Saudi Arabia remains a Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office human rights priority country, particularly because of the use of the death penalty and restrictions on freedom of expression. We seek to engage the kingdom and support positive reform, and Lord Ahmed, the minister responsible for our Middle East and North Africa policy, visited the kingdom in February to advance UK strategic engagement on human rights specifically. Key areas included promoting freedom of religious belief, lobbying on individual human rights cases of concern, and encouraging justice reforms. Saudi Arabia is committed to an ambitious program of economic and social reform through Vision 2030, which has already delivered significant change, including increased freedoms and economic opportunity for women. However, the human rights situation is likely to remain a key issue in our engagement for the foreseeable future. He went on, through ministers and our embassy in Riyadh, we regularly raise the death penalty as a key issue of concern with Saudi Arabia. We will continue to do so, and no aspect of our relationship with Saudi Arabia prevents us from speaking frankly about human rights. It was said in the notice from the office of the Prime Minister Boris Johnson concerning his visits just over 12 months ago that he raised human rights issues with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The Foreign Office Minister also said in that debate, the UK has always been clear that Khashoggi's merger was a terrible crime. We called for a thorough, credible, and transparent investigation to hold those responsible to account and impose sanctions against 20 Saudis involved. I cannot speculate about future designations, the minister said, or sanctions, as that would reduce their impact. But be assured that we will speak up clearly and call out any confessions secured under torture which are abhorrent and against all that we stand for. There was no mention there of the international view that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, himself the effective ruler of Saudi Arabia, was himself involved in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and of course, no penalties against him. Now, one of the issues that Sanad has brought to attention publicly during the course of the last year is the case of Mohammed Al-Qahtani. His case has received attention not just from organizations such as Sanad, but the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, Mary Lawler, herself issued communications regarding Dr. Mohammed Al-Qahtani and 2 others in a communication that she sent to the government of Saudi Arabia in November 2022. And recently she has released the information, or her office has released information about Dr. Mohammed Al-Qahtani and the others, and the response of the Saudi regime to the concerns that they have raised. What Mary Lawler herself said was that Dr. Mohammed Al-Qahtani is a human rights defender, a founder member of the Saudi Civil and Political Rights Association, and which is a leading human rights organization in Saudi Arabia. He was convicted now 10 years ago and sentenced to 10 years in prison for, and I quote, refusing to submit to the will of the king, incitement, and communicating with foreign entities. Now, on the issue of the West double standards and the lack of a response from Saudi Arabia to the issues that are raised, the case of Dr. Al-Qahtani was included in communications from the United Nations, starting in 2012, and then repeated in 2013, 2019, 2020, 2021, and then at the end of 2022. He had that, as I've said, a 10-year term of imprisonment imposed against him for allegedly providing false information. In May of last year, just under a year ago, he went on hunger strike to demand his transfer from his cell after reportedly being beaten by co-detainees who suffer from mental illness. His request was not met. In October 2022, he was again attacked by co-detainees who suffer from mental illness. Now, in addition to just mentioning one individual, Dr. Mohammed Al-Qahtani, and I could clearly mention more, there are others who are released at the end of their sentence, but accompanied with that release are travel bans, usually equivalent to the same level of time that they're held in prison. Now, what Sanad learned was that the number of those banned from travel exceeded 70,000 citizens, and that was both male and female. And this included the families of detainees, activists, and dissidents, as well as families from the Al Saud family itself and those close to them. And what we know as well is that the Saudi regime continued a demolition and removal operations in Jeddah. It has particularly focused on the Huwaitet tribe, moving them in order to, they say, for the purposes of economic advancement. But hundreds have been made homeless without any response to them. So what we have seen continuously is obviously an increase in the human rights violations. The reason there was a debate in the UK Parliament in November last year was because there were recorded to be 150 executions in total at the time that took place by the end of November. And some of those members of Parliament that took part in the debate were themselves raising the issue as to whether, for example, there are double standards. There is a fund called the Gulf Strategy Fund. Money is given to countries such as Saudi Arabia by the UK government, and questions were raised, therefore, as to whether or not there are double standards going on. So it isn't simply a case of organizations like Sanad raising concerns, but equally those concerns are much wider. But that is simply by way of a brief introduction. What I'm going to do now, I don't know whether David Haig has actually been able to join us, but clearly Fahad is with us, the official spokesperson for Sanad, and I'm going to hand over to Fahad, who's particularly going to address the issue of the role that activists and members of the families of those who are being tortured, imprisoned, or held under travel bans, and what role can they actually play. So I'll now hand over to Fahad.
Thank you, Dr. Sue, for your kind words and your brief and your introduction about the human rights situation back in my country, in Saudi Arabia. Actually, to be honest, I didn't prepare myself for saying in particular words about the role of detainees and the family of detainees in Saudi Arabia. I didn't prepare myself because I choose to speak with my heart to heart to everybody in this world as a former detainee, exactly because I, among all people, I know the exact situation back in Saudi Arabia and in Saudi prisons. But firstly, I would like to welcome Mr. David. Hello, Mr. David.
Hi, good afternoon. Apologies, I was had IT glitchy issues, but hopefully they're nothing sinister.
Good afternoon. Yeah. So as I said before, I didn't prepare myself for this seminar because I choose to speak from my heart as a former detainee in my country back in Saudi Arabia, and the rule we are in Sanad, and as in every human rights organization that focusing on Middle East in general or in Saudi Arabia in particular, we use every occasion like this to speak about the rule and the golden rule, if I may say, about the detainees' families and what they should say and what they should provide us as an information. As a former detainee in Saudi Arabia, I was in prison for 3 months. No one knows about me. My family didn't know about either I'm alive or dead. Nobody looks after me or say a word about me because no one is know who is Fahad back then, and I feel back when I sometimes remember those dark memories in my head when I remember when I were in prison. I was hoping for someone to speak about me. I was hoping anyone to say something about me, about what's going on with me, about the pressure that I face and I suffer every single day in my cell. So as an activist now, I can see the positive effects about the families if they are choose to talk, if they are choose to speak about their detainees in prison, about their suffering, about what's going on exactly inside Saudi Arabia prison. Uh, when they speak, no one can stop them because it's I believe it's a common sense. You know, when you are beating from someone as a child, this is the first thing you start to learn is to stand up for yourself and start to defend yourself against anyone who trying to take anything from you. How about your freedom when there is someone who's taking your freedom, not only your freedom but your health as well and your mental health as well, and it's even when you are out of the prison, a lot of detainees are becoming terrifying every single days with nightmares chasing them every night. They cannot back to live their normal life again, especially when the time of the prison it's too long. It's like a years or something like that. So what I'm saying to the families of detainees, I know what the Saudi regime is trying to do with you. They are trying to keep you quiet, not to speak about your loving ones. But if you are choosing to be quiet, even more pressure would happen to your loving ones. Because back in Saudi Arabia, I know the system back then, and I believe Mr. David, with his expertise in UAE, I believe it's a quite the same system that ruling the Gulf area in general and Mediterranean and uh, the Arab world in general. It's the same system, the same mentality. There is no rules, there is no courts, there is no power of courts back in these countries. And once you are a detainees, even if you didn't do anything, that will be it. This will be like a black mark. It will be starting to chase you all over your life. And for the families, you must start to speak about your loving one in persons. You must say something about what they are facing and standing up to this regime because now more than 3,000 detainees in Saudi Arabia. And we actually, even if when we are working as in Sanad organization, and Sanad organization is only focusing on Saudi Arabia human rights situation and the human rights in Saudi Arabia. And we are in this organization, we don't know the exact number of detainees, of political detainees in Saudi Arabia. So why is that? Because the family is not talking. Uh, more pressure is happening to the regime. We are not living in 1990 anymore, or the ages before communication and before internet and before social media, etc. Now we can put even more pressure on the regime if we start to speak, if we choose to be more courage and speak loudly about what is going on. The main title, I believe, for this seminar, it's the Western government's perspective about Saudi Arabia and what exactly how they can see the Saudi regime. So I would like to hear from Mr. David about this perspective, because I really, as a Saudi activist, as a former detainee as well, I would like to hear about the perspective of the Western governments, how they can see the Saudi regime right now. And like what Dr. So mentioned before, she spoke about Jamal Khashoggi case, and she spoke about Yemen war. Are these two big cases that should be chasing Saudi Arabia regime are now forgotten to the Western governments, or not?
So David, by all means, let's introduce you. You're an internationally renowned human rights lawyer who specializes in the Middle East, and some significant cases that I've known you've taken up and continuing to deal with. It is particularly important, because of your experience, to hear your response to these issues under this theme of the West double standards. So David, if you would like to make your contribution, we very much look forward to hearing from you.
Of course. Well, very nice to meet you both. I mean, as I think Farhad was set out probably better than I ever could, the importance of why the West must not have double standards. He set out very clearly, from the point of view as a victim, but as assisting others, quite why this is very important. And he also mentioned as well, I mean, I've done a lot of work in the UAE, and obviously looking at Saudi, you can compare the two different countries. And I think certainly even in the last couple of weeks, in England, certainly, it's been a very, there's been quite a lot of news in terms of the human rights world. So there's put, again, the focus on Saudi. The first of those was a couple of weeks ago, the Amnesty International annual report of each of the countries came out. And it was the Amnesty report, actually. I don't know if anyone's read it here, but it was the Amnesty report that set out very clearly the phrase double standards. And in that report, it set out the double standards of how the West effectively dealt with the atrocities in Ukraine, and put sanctions against Russia and various individuals, and reacted within days. And it compared that to areas where people in the Gulf region, for instance, people in Saudi, the Saudi regime, Egypt, etc., and also in Yemen had conducted heinous human rights abuses and war crimes, and compared the difference between those two. And so there clearly are, I think that was something that raised the point in very big detail after a long study, obviously, that there are clear double standards. And those are things that have been accusations against the Western governments for a very long time. And we need to kind of ask our question selves that, if we only care if our enemies are actually the ones breaking human rights around the world and breaching human rights and abusing human rights, does that mean that we care about them at all? And I think that's the situation that we're in, because essentially friendly dictators, so-called friendly dictators that we see in Saudi, that we see in the UAE, are acceptable to the UK because of, and even to the West. We've seen recently also, I think at the end of last year, we saw effectively Biden's administration pave the way for the MBS to basically be exempt from prosecution for matters relating to the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So you clearly have a double standard in terms of, depending on whether we deem a murderous dictator to be a friend of the West, then we can look the other way and almost accept these heinous human rights abuses. And then you compare that to other heinous dictators like Putin. And I think that is very obvious. And it's something that even only last week that we saw in England came into the fray, because we have, I don't know if any of you noticed this, but the UK obviously has a very well international football world. Essentially, everything's runs around football. So, and we had the Premier League, which runs the majority of all the Premier League clubs in the UK, and it's something that I'm obviously aware of because I used to run one of those Premier League clubs. And there's a thing called the owners and directors test, and what that effectively means is that people that buy into football or that control football in the UK should be fit and proper. And as we all know, the Saudi regime effectively took over one of our big clubs, Newcastle, a while ago, and there was a lot of controversy when it did that. Now, because of that controversy and other Gulf countries looking to buy clubs, the Premier League introduced what they said were the strengthening of these owners and directors tests to cover human rights abuses. And I'll come on to why this is very important in a moment. And the way that they are judging whether or not people have abused human rights is by whether or not those people are on the effectively what our version of the Magnitsky sanctions, so the global human rights sanctions regulations. And this is a very interesting kind of way to look at whether or not we are treating different people, different dictators differently. And if you look at the current list of who is on that, now people that should be on that should be the Saudi ruler. There should be senior people in the Saudi regime. There should be the ruler of Dubai, who has been found by English courts to have broken the law in England. None of those people are on that list. Yet there are obviously lots and lots of Russians and North Koreans, etc., on that list. So you can see in that list alone the double standards. And when you see when we're introducing, for example, with football, but other areas, that's the standard bearer as to whether or not someone is a human rights abuser. That is very worrying. And I think it's a very good example of why there are clearly double standards.
Yeah. Dr. Su, if I may speak.
Of course.
Yeah, I would like to ask you, Mr. David, do you agree that what Joe Biden did when he was running for the office in the United States and his strong position back then, and how he changes, how everything changes when he become a president? Do you believe that what Joe Biden did before and after he became a president regarding to the human rights in Saudi Arabia, do you believe that what he did expresses the Western governments in face of Saudi Arabia regime?
I think politicians lying to get support, or politicians saying one thing and doing another, is something that is we're always going to see. And I think at the time taking very strong positions against human rights abuses plays to his democratic base, which obviously voted him in. And then when he's in power, there's obviously quite a different thing that he has to deal with. So I think it was very disappointing to see what he's done. But that just shows you, I think, how the West are looking at the people in these Gulf dictators, not just the Saudi dictator.
Yeah. What is the solution? This is my question to you and to Dr. Su as well. What is the solution to force these Western governments to do something, to do their moral duty for the human rights situation back in Saudi Arabia or in Gulf area as well?
I think I'm just going to come in a moment there, Fahad, because one thing I also wanted to introduce, because of its increasing significance from my point of view, comes within this term kind of sports washing. And we know that the F1, the Formula One race has taken place in Saudi Arabia, and the only British person I know of who spoke against that was one of the drivers. Nobody else did so. But also I've noticed recently that FIFA, the International Football Association, has just allowed the Saudi tourist body to co-sponsor the Women's World Cup taking place in Australia towards the end of July and August 2023. And we know there's the big fights that have taken place, probably the biggest fights that we've ever seen, with people like Joshua, again, a British sportsman, taking part in a fight in Saudi Arabia. I think it's also, I'm conscious of the fact, as someone who follows events in Israel and Palestine, that that the boycotting, this investment sanctions movement has grown substantially in relation to Palestine and Israel. And I just wonder also where we might actually be able to bring some influence to bear over that in terms of individual artists, sportsmen or women, or others not actually signing off on the way that the Saudi regime is behaving. I think that's to throw that in with your question, Fahad, because we are seeing this more and more with that interaction between the Western countries and Saudi Arabia in particular, I think.
Yeah, indeed. The sport watching is a very important point we should focus on here, and the effect of that inside the community, because this is the most important thing. You know, the governments here in UK are working alongside the prescriptive of the people. And my question is, this is maybe the most important question when we want to talk about the sport watching. Is that will affect how the people here in UK will see the Saudi Arabia and see the women's back in Saudi Arabia and see the violation, the huge violation of human rights in Saudi Arabia, because we are, and I would like to speak with Mr. David, because he was, as he said before, he was running a Premier League football club, and how this can affect the sport watching, can affect the prescriptive of people inside UK, and the prescriptive of people when it's affecting, how can it affect the government decision?
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I'll touch a bit on your first question before Dr. Sue spoke now. And, you know, you're always going to have, you know, Western governments trying to cozy up to despots and dictators with a lot of potential for investment, and also that in their mind provide some at least military security in certain regions. So you're always going to see, whether it's the America, the EU, or even to a larger extent now in England, you know, the UK's come out of the EU. You're going to see that it is going to continue to happen. Now, you know, in a perfect world, you know, in my view as a human rights lawyer and as a Brit, you know, we as the UK should be effectively, as we once did, you know, paving the way for other countries in the world of human rights, not going backwards. And I do, you know, it's a very sad situation, I think, in the UK at the moment. And there's been various reports. There was the Amnesty report, there was the Civicus Monitor report a couple of weeks before that, all saying that in the UK, not just the way that we deal with other nations around the world, and they're either human rights abuses or bringing people into the UK, such as migrants and asylum seekers, but the way that we treat people from a human rights perspective is getting worse. But to answer your question, I think, and you know, if we look at one of the cases that I worked on in terms of the UAE, and a lady that we acted for, a lady called Princess Latifa, who was the daughter of the ruler. That was back in 2018 when she left. And if you look at how, and this ties in with the sports watching quite well, if you look at Saudi, you know, 3-4 years ago, you know, they were not looking to the kind of the West, as it were. You know, even this morning I was watching an advert that was basically advertising tourism in Saudi. You know, I lived in the Middle East for 11 years, and you know, when I first moved there, you know, you would not see tourist adverts, you would not see these big sporting events, you would not see the likes of Cristiano Ronaldo playing for Al Nassr, the local teams, and you wouldn't see any of that. They didn't want, effectively, you know, the Western tourist dollar, the Western visitors. That seems, at least on the face of it, to be changing. In not quite the same as it did in Dubai, but it may speed up. You're seeing these, you know, mile-long, whatever it is, you know, cities being built in the desert. So it's very interesting when you look at the way Saudi is going. If Saudi continues to go down that route of not just wanting the oil money and the military money, but wanting the tourism dollars and those types of the more of the kind of the consumer businesses, I think it's going to line them up into a situation where the types of campaigns that we worked on Latifa might have some success. So if you look at when we helped the Princess Latifa at the beginning, you know, back in 2018, Sheikh Mohammed, the Dubai ruler, was very much seen as almost like a demigod in that country. He was an untouchable person. He was revered and supposedly loved. He's, after a 4-year campaign, which wasn't backed by the politicians at the time at all, everyone told us something to do with England, you won't get her free, he'll never let her go, etc., etc. But we didn't give up, and we carried on using the media, using social media, and not wanting to coin a phrase, but effectively people power. And no politicians listened for the first 2-3 years. But when we managed to get evidence from a secret phone that everything that they'd been saying about her was untrue effectively, and that was broadcast in a BBC Panorama, the politicians had no choice but to stand up and do something. And then we saw Secretary Blinken of the US mentioning Latifa's name. We saw Boris Johnson at the time. So we saw all these politicians forced into that situation because of the press, because of the people and the voters ultimately. So, and it's obviously that the thing that enabled that to happen was the fact that Dubai wants the West and wants the tourism. And my point here is, if Saudi's trying to go down that road, which they seem to be, 10, 15 years ago, I think it would have been very difficult to have a kind of a Western human rights campaign abuses in Saudi that would be successful in terms of making changes in Saudi, whether it would be from a commercial pressure point or a political one. But if they continue to go down that route, reaching out like the UAE has, we've seen how those things can push the UAE and people around them into action. And then that's, like I said, coming on to sports washing now. I mean, that's something, and I wrote an article about this a couple of days ago about the changes in the Premier League rules, because the changes would not stop Saudi ultimately. I mean, Saudi on the one hand denied to the Premier League that it's them that owns the Newcastle, yet that we've seen the very same people have been noted in litigation relating to golf and in the US has actually been part of the government. So, they're telling fibs to one or the other. But what we've got is this very interesting situation now where all of a sudden, while they wouldn't have been prevented now, what the government in the UK, what the Premier League have done, they've suddenly put the focus on these Magnitsky sanctions, the global human rights sanctions in the UK. So one would imagine now that a lot of focus of human rights organisations, of victims and their families, but also even potentially rival bidders, will be to ensure that these dictators, that applications are made, which anyone can make in England to get people on the sanction list. Lots more applications will be made, so there'll probably be even more focus on these human rights or abuses of the likes of Saudi. And I think, it's going to take time, but I do think that if Saudi continues down a route of effectively seeking, at least on the face of it, to open up to the West, they're going to face more and more criticism, but it's not going to be initially from the politicians. It's going to be from the people, basically. And we've shown in the UAE how that can work. But there is a big gap, I think, at the moment between the UAE and Saudi in terms of that. But I think it's I think it's it shows there is possibility that can change. It's just going to take time and an awful lot of effort.
I just want to come back to that, but also Fahad, your point about the role of people who have that lived experience of the repression of the Saudi regime, because what we've seen recently is that a previously UK PhD student, Salma Al-Shahab, who was studying at Leeds University, was originally given a 34-year sentence for a few tweets. She didn't have a large following. That was reduced recently to 27 years with a 27-year travel ban. But she and 7 other women, and Salma has gone public over this. The others, we do not know their names as far as I know, but Salma has gone public. She's the mother of 2 young children, and she's gone public about going on hunger strike with these other women in order to protest the sentences and the arbitrary nature of the penalties against them. And I just wonder whether, for example, I haven't seen much about this, despite the fact that Salma is a Leeds University PhD student. I don't know whether the university has said anything, or even if any student organizations have said anything. But when women like that go public, I think when you compare that, say, to the sponsoring of the Women's World Cup, then I think that begins to resonate. So I do wonder if there's more that we could and should be doing, where people and families are willing to speak out. We know when it came to being detained in countries such as Iran, that public profile and the persistence of family members or others was absolutely essential to ensuring the focus, and not just the release of those individuals, but the attention to the authorities. So I do wonder, Fahad, perhaps yourself, is there more that we could be doing to support families who've got people who are suffering there without it drawing even greater attention to them, because that's the penalty that can be applied, isn't it? That can mean to greater repression. And how do we balance that out between focusing on those who are willing to go public and giving them support, whilst not also making it even harder for them or the family that they've got back home?
Yeah, and this is the most hard things in our work. It's like walking on the heads of snakes without getting beaten. It's so hard, but I would like to focus on what we in Senate did recently in Mother's Day. Now, when you speak about Salma al-Shihab, we recognize an event on Newcastle, outside Newcastle Stadium, exactly on Bobby Robinson, I believe I said the name right, Bobby Robinson statue outside Newcastle Stadium, and we spoke about Salma al-Shihab in Mother's Day, and we sent a message with Yvonne Bradley help. She said strong words about Salma al-Shihab and as a mother, and actually speaking on Bradley, she become with this beautiful line about Newcastle and about the Saudi investment in Newcastle. She said, "You can buy our club, but you cannot buy our silence." Back to your question, Dr. Su, this is very hard because uh, people here in UK or in Western in general, uh, maybe Mr. David, he knows that as well because of his experience in Middle East and in Gulf area. The situation in UAE is not too far about the situation in Saudi Arabia. I'm talking not about the lifestyle between two countries, but I'm talking about how these two regimes thinks when it comes to human rights and when it comes to anyone who's trying to stand up in their faces. So in Saudi Arabia, it's like North Korea. You cannot do anything without a risk. You must risk something. You must, or you will feel fear or entire your for entire your life. And this is the problem here we are facing. Some of the detainees' families are trying to speak about their families in prison. They are trying to speak about their mothers and daughters and sisters and their loving one in prison, in Saudi prison, because of a tweet. People in Saudi Arabia are prisoned for years because of single tweets on Twitter or because of saying some words about the Saudi regime in a private chat with the friends. They can go for years in prisons, and nobody knows where are they. There are like more than five main prisons in Saudi Arabia where the political activists are keeping. No one's of their families know where are they, and they're visiting after after suffering and lot of pressure and maybe even speaking to someone who knows someone who knows someone until you can see your loving one and see a member of your family and know whether he's alive or dead. So back to your question, Dr. Su, actually there is not so much we can did, uh, but we are still believing that the families of detainees finally have the courage to speak, and we do have safe way to contact us when they are trying to contact us. A lot of them actually contact us, but not enough member, and a lot of them, it's like 50%. Who speak to us about their loving one, they ask us not to do anything. They ask us not to write about their loving one in prison, about their stories, about why they are in prison in the first place. We ask them all the time, why you told us about your loving one and your family in prison, and you don't want us to speak about them or write anything about them. And their answer is the same, always the same, because we are afraid more pressure and more suffering our loving one in prison will face if we speak about them. But let me tell you something, Dr. Su, and I believe you already knows that, and also Mr. David knows that. As a human rights activist, I think, I believe, and even there is a clues and evidence, strong evidence, that the families who speak about their detainees in prison, the quite opposite is happening. They will face less pressure in prison, and we see that I cannot say their names, but we can see it that we do have an evidence for some detainees we spoke about, and we go public and speak about them. And after that, we ask the families what's going on. And surprisingly, they told us that they now they let us know where they are. They let us know. They let us visit them, and they give us like a brief about their situation and why they are in prison. So more families speaking and more details given, and more speaking about their families in prison, in media or Twitter or social media, is actually have this positive, very positive effect about the families and about the detainee itself, themselves. Sorry.
Maybe I could just illustrate that a bit to support your point, Fahad. I mean, as by occupation, I'm a yes, I'm in the human rights field, but it's in particular immigration and asylum. So it's people seeking asylum. And often what is said about someone who's claiming asylum from a country which is known for its repression is that, well, you're just insignificant. You mean nothing to them, and therefore you'll be fine. You're not prominent, you're not a leader. And the point that we often make is it's those who are prominent that don't get the same repression, because the public is more likely to notice it. And I think it supports your point, Fahad, that if the Saudi regime knows that people are prepared to speak out and to draw attention to their loved ones, then they are under pressure, which they're not under any pressure at all if there is no public dimension to that person's experience at all. Exactly. So I think it's easy for me to say it. I mean, thankfully you are speaking from experience and you're living it, but it's just from experience. It's usually those that are hidden, where the authorities of any country can do what they like without any reprisals. So it's just finding a way to support them and to perhaps enable that to happen, I guess, particularly when if people have decided to go public, how do we then support that campaign to do it? But I think that's particularly interesting. But there's also another element. We have seen recently 2 US citizens released. And I just wonder why it is they may not, I don't mean released as in allowed to travel from Saudi Arabia, but they have at least been able to they've been released from prison. One of them is Mr. Sahad Al-Mahdi. And I don't know myself what's led to that. We talked a little while ago about Joe Biden when he was running his campaign. He said one thing, he was certainly backing the whole campaign around the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and then he became president and it changed for reasons that David's illustrated. But clearly the US is putting some pressure on for the release of some of its citizens, at least from prison. And I don't know whether there is any, Sanad, Fahad, has any information, or even David, about why it is that certain US citizens are being released and where that might lead and how that might help in relation to other individuals.
Yeah, I think that this is the main difference between what Donald Trump did and Joe Biden did. You see, Donald Trump, he gave the Saudi regime the green light to do whatever you want to do, whatever it takes to remain. He supported MBS to the bones. But when Joe Biden, he came when he was running, as I said before, and as you said just now, he said he changes his mind. His word is changing. His position was changing before and after he became a president. But at the same time, he's starting to push to the Saudi regime to release the US citizens. And this is actually what we are here now to speak about, the double standards about the Western governments. It's clear now that Joe Biden's and he is the man who described as the most beautiful, most powerful man in the free worlds, and now he is only defending his US citizens, Saudi US citizens. And how about the rest of the detainees in prisons?
Mm. Mm.
If we Mr. David want to speak from different perspective about the countries, the Western governments, you know, we all know that we are not living in utopia of Plato. So there is a fine and dividing line between what's political rights and economic rights the Western government must fight for in their relationship with Saudi Arabia, and also between their moral duty to the human rights in Saudi Arabia. I believe once we understand as a human rights activist, once we understand this defining line, and once we can answer this tricky and complicated question about the difference between their rights of the economy and political rights and doing what's right about Human Rights Watch. I believe as a human rights activist, if we can answer this tricky and complicated question, we can boost even more and defend even more about our cases. Don't you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. I mean, you are always, since time immaterial, you've always had issues, you know, of geopolitical ones with various countries, and they will continue. They will not go away. You know, you're seeing now even, you know, concerns from the West that the likes of Saudi and the UAE are cozying up now to China and other countries, and you look at investments in Africa and so on. And so you're seeing this, but it's always going to be there. It's you know, I think the West needs to you know, continue to protect and promote human rights around the world, not pull back from that. But I do think that, you know, there's some, you know, when you know, if you know, with Saudi reaching out to the world and kind of wanting to open up more, you know, you've got a situation that, you know, a couple of weeks ago you had people protesting outside a football club in England about people in Saudi that were being abused. That is something that 3-4 years ago would never have happened. So you are seeing these cases, you know, people in, for instance, Newcastle talking about people in Saudi jails and they're having their human rights abuses. You know, these are things that would never have happened before. There's a focus that was on, that's now on human rights and rights of people in Saudi that was never there before. You know, racing drivers not going, pop stars, you know, not going and raising the point. So I think that provides great hope and exposure onto individual cases, as well as you know, the actual global problem over there. And I think that's something that you know, we as NGOs and human rights activists need to focus on. And something which is good is that everyone now, we're seeing a lot of the NGOs that focus on the Middle East regions all working together. And I think that's the key thing. You know, as Dr. Sue said, when you have these cases that come up, we need to make sure that the people that across certainly in the UK, you know, we use every potential opportunity, whether that's demonstrations at a football club or demonstrations at a golf game, or, you know, if I mean, I doubt very much, but if MBS decides he wants to try and come to the coronation in you know, three weeks' time, there needs to be demonstrations. I mean, myself and my group and a colleague of mine, Tina, and others, we had a demonstration, you know, in relation to the funeral, and I think there was an awful lot of press and attention on whether these Gulf dictators would be invited, and ultimately for the actual funeral, they weren't. You know, some of them came for things before, etc., but they weren't. And I think that's, you know, something that we're focusing on also in relation to MBS, to make sure, and we're starting that a campaign to make sure that he isn't invited, and that if he is invited, he certainly doesn't come, because you know, and I think that actually the Saudi and regime trying to reach out and trying to open themselves up a little bit and wanting to be able to be a bit more international is actually something which indirectly is actually, I think, helping human rights cases and advocacy there, because not because obviously the Saudi ruler cares about it, but because the Western people, not necessarily the Western governments, do. And I think that's something that we can see is a very positive situation at the moment. It's something that I think is really worth focusing on.
Yeah, Dr. So I would like to hear also from you in this point. It's like what even Bradley said about Newcastle and Sportwatch. She said, you can buy our club, but you cannot buy our silence. Same thing goes with the regimes and Western governments. I mean, you can do your political and your economic rights with Saudi Arabia and your investment in Saudi Arabia as a country in this world. But this doesn't mean that you start to deal with double standards and start to stop do nothing about human rights situation in Saudi Arabia and do nothing about your moral duty about human rights situation in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I never thought we'd hear so much mention of football in this discussion today, but it's significant because we know that we've only got to look at the Gary Lineker, famous for his football commentary and being a brilliant football player in the past, but when he said something about the UK government's plans in relation to effectively a ban on the right to seek asylum and links with the language that was being used in 1930s Germany, just how that got the public speaking. But in addition, you know, there are ways in which we've got to address members of the public, say in this country, to raise their concerns and raise their voice and say, we don't want you to be doing this in relation to where their interests are now. I don't know whether you know, for example, you know, one of the biggest football clubs in Scotland is Celtic. They have a very pro-Palestinian position. You will often at live games, you'll see banners that are carried, which are drawing attention to that now. If people who are actually Newcastle United fans were willing to actually begin to make comments about the ownership of their club at a game, so it's seen, maybe it's been done and I just haven't been watching, but those kind of things, we've got to address people where their interests are now. If the thing that particularly resonates with me about Salma Al-Shihab is that she's a mother with 2 young children, and those children, if she completes that sentence, will have grown up and they will have lost so much, and she must be suffering greatly as a result. That resonates with women who have had or have children, and as well as other family-minded people. And I think we've got to make more of that to bring that home in order to say, you shouldn't be doing this. We don't want you using our money in this particular way. You know, those of us in the sort of asylum field, we don't want you paying millions to Rwanda to effectively abuse people who are sent there. We don't want you paying France to build a detention center. That's not what we want as people. But we've got to find a way to address people where they are and where their interests are, and then build on that. And I know that's easy for me to say, but I guess we've got to look more at that. I don't know if that partly answers your question, Fahad.
Yeah, at the end of this seminar, I would like to use this occasion, like I always did, and send a message to the families of detainees, to the detainees' families back in Saudi Arabia, to speak and to have the courage to stand up in front of the Saudi regime as well.
Thank you. And I'm sure we endorse that, and just give as much support as we possibly can going forward. And I guess in just bringing this to a close, is there any final word that you want to say, David, yourself?
Yeah, I think similar to the message that you and Farhad said, is that, you know, and it's something that we were always told, not just on Latifa, but other people, don't go to the media, don't speak up. It is the only thing that protected her and the people that we now continue to help. And it's the only thing that is actually affecting change. And if you look at what happened in the UAE over the last 4 years since that case, change, you know, there was change. So I think, you know, you've got to speak up, you've got to stand up. As difficult as it is, you need to take that bit of bravery. And I think, you know, if you look at the examples, and again, using the example of Princess Latifa, but also Princess Haya, her stepmother that escaped, you know, a couple of years after, there is hope. You know, things can change and things are changing, but that only happens when you speak up and when you cast a light on it. So, you know, I think, and I think the last thing to say to the people in Saudi wondering whether or not it's the right thing to do is that they've got to look at the people that are supporting them. And to comment on your point about Newcastle fans, you know, there is a great group there, Sue, called Newcastle Fans Against Sports Washing, Newcastle United Fans Against Sports Washing. Now, it's not all of the fans, because a lot of fans just think, oh, we can now afford expensive players, let's not worry about human rights, but it's a growing number. So there are people, you know, in England, around the world, whether because of football or you know, anything else, that actually care, that see them. You know, and I think that's an important message, because, you know, these dictatorships want to isolate those people, make them think they're alone and there's no one looking, but that's not true. They're not alone. And I think that's the message that I would send to people over there watching this.
Yeah. And
also thank you. Sorry, Fahad. Yes.
Yeah, and just I just want to say that stop waiting for any position from the Western government. If you speak now, you will make the difference without any interfering with the Western governments, and also without any help from them.
And that is the right point upon which to finish. So thank you, David. Thank you, Fahad. And thank you for Sanad and all the work that you're doing now and that you're going to continue to do. We wish you all the very best. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
everyone.
Thank you.